This is a story of a high-performing, highly rated Navy SEAL who served his nation with valor, became injured as a result of that service, and was left behind.
Frank Larkin is a former Navy SEAL. His son followed in his footsteps, a highly decorated SEAL who did 4 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. At age 29, Ryan took his own life.
He said, if anything ever happens to me, I want my body used for traumatic brain research.
How many men and women in the military do you think are subjected to this potential type of injury?
The official numbers are that there's about 375,000. We think the real numbers may be substantially higher than that.
There's been a quiet but dramatic shift in where we get our prescription drugs. We are increasingly dependent on China. If China stopped making or sending its ingredients to the United States for any reason, would it cause shortages in the United States?
Within months, pharmacy shelves in the United States would be bare.
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. Our military has almost 200,000 troops deployed around the world. We are still at war in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. U.S. military injuries and deaths top 58,000 for just Iraq and Afghanistan alone. That doesn't count suicides and a related silent destroyer you probably haven't heard much about that's of growing concern: concussions our warriors get in training and in action. Today we begin with Ryan's story, an elite Navy SEAL whose sacrifice may help save others, even in civilian life. Frank Larkin was Sergeant-at-Arms, the chief law enforcement officer for the U.S. Senate until last March.
The President of the United States!
That's him leading President Trump into the State of the Union address. Larkin is also an American warrior. He was a member of the Navy's elite SEAL team.
This really captures the awards that Ryan received.
His son Ryan followed in his footsteps, also a highly decorated Navy SEAL who did 4 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Last October, Ryan was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery.
This is a story of a high-performing, highly rated Navy SEAL who served his nation with valor, became injured as a result of that service, and was left behind. He had made statements such as, you know, it's going to take guys killing themselves before the system wakes up that they got a problem. He also said that I'm not going to live to an old age. I'm broken inside. Something's wrong inside my head. Nobody's listening.
At age 29, Ryan took his own life.
The morning of Sunday, April 23rd, we had come home from an overnight trip and found that he had taken his life in the basement of our home. Ryan was dressed in his SEAL Team 7 t-shirt. He had illuminated a shadow box that contained his ribbons, medals, and other insignia.
Ryan long believed he suffered traumatic brain injury from concussions during his military service, but he was unable to get the diagnosis or effective treatment.
He said, if anything ever happens to me, I want my body used for traumatic brain research. So on that horrible day of April 23rd, we were able to, on his behalf, donate his brain for that study.
Ryan's story and the analysis of his donated brain tissue are helping open doors, revealing how a soldier's post-traumatic stress may be exacerbated or even caused by brain injuries. Can you just give an example of the sorts of things they're exposed to that can cause them concussive injuries or brain injury?
Ryan was a sniper, so he fired high caliber sniper weapons, you know, the 50 caliber category. Gives an awful lot of pressure. Exposure to IEDs, which, you know, the battlefield was littered with IEDs. There's a variety of sources that can cause, you know, concussive effects that ultimately could result in damage.
Because the damage is invisible on regular MRI scans, doctors long lumped the mysterious suffering of brain-injured troops under the catch-all of post-traumatic stress disorder. But a sea change began in 2011. What new do you know today since 2011 about this?
Probably more has been discovered from 2010 to today than in the entire history of science before 2010. So, because there's been so much interest and attention focused on this problem.
Neurologist David Brody heads up traumatic brain injury research at the Uniformed Services University. He helped lead a landmark study in 2011.
Before that, traumatic brain injury, a concussion, was something you just shrugged off. And are you hurt or are you injured? And you just got back up and went back at it, both in sports and in the military and in real life. But we recognized around that time that there were real serious consequences of concussive traumatic brain injury, that there was a lot more injury than people had previously recognized.
I had an idea.
Dr. Brody and his team were first to use a new MRI technique called diffusion tensor imaging on soldiers. That allowed them to examine axons, the most vulnerable part of the brain, where long wires transmit information like celery stalks move water.
But after injury, the brain's axons become like celery soup. Same color as celery, may smell like celery, but quite disrupted. And now the water is going to diffuse pretty much the same in all directions. So we could use diffusion tensor imaging to detect the difference between celery and celery soup in the brain.
The results were shocking. Brains that looked normal on regular MRI scans were obviously damaged when imaged using the new technique. Dr. Brody found abnormalities in nearly 1/3 of the soldiers who'd been injured in blasts. How many men and women in the military you think are subjected to this potential type of injury, whether they're in the training or they're actually out in the field being exposed to this?
The official numbers are that there's about 375,000 U.S. military service members that have had traumatic brain injury from 2001 till the present. We think the real numbers may be substantially higher than that. It's probably maybe twice that many.
What percentage is that of the military?
Some estimates are that between 10 and 20% of deployed military service members have a brain injury during their deployment.
The findings led to new military directives on how to detect and treat brain injury from explosive concussions. Yet heroes like Ryan are still slipping through the cracks years later. He never even had an exam using the special MRI technique.
That's not something that a regular doctor can just order. I think he had conventional scans, as far as I can tell.
How did it come to your attention that he perhaps had brain injury?
It's when he had the second, third tours that were back-to-back that we noticed that, you know, he wasn't the Ryan that we saw enter the Navy. The wheels kind of came off. We saw an amplification of the anxiety. We saw depression ebb and flow. He was having problems with disorganization, a lot more issues with memory. Alcohol played a role as he was trying to get to sleep. He was not having a lot of success with the medications that they were putting him on. He started suffering what I call is, systematic injury of, they started hanging labels on him. Substance abuser, alcohol abuser, prescription drug abuser, treatment failure, operationally unfit. This just created more wounds. For somebody that had literally been a top-rated operator to now have to wear these labels was something that was very much a struggle for him.
Ryan's journal reveals desperation and despair. "I need treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury," he wrote. And speaking of his honorable but forced discharge in 2016, he wrote, "I have been separated from everything that I love." Ryan's brain revealed telltale scars of concussive injury visible under a microscope after death. Even if he'd been diagnosed with traumatic brain injury in life, there's no cure, only intensive treatment for symptoms, headaches, mood disorders, and sleep problems. What would you say is an important key to someone like Ryan Larkins who's seeking help and feeling all these things you describe and things aren't working for him?
We're working really hard to find new MRI methods that will be able to see that scarring right at the junction between gray and white matter that I mentioned earlier, but we're not there yet. So it's clearly a lot more research needs to be performed before we're able to make a definite diagnosis of somebody like Ryan Larkin while he's alive. And that's the ultimate goal.
When we return, with so much concern focused on football players and concussions, we'll look at the much larger impact in our military and how research into it could impact civilian life. When we began investigating traumatic brain injury in our troops, it sounded a lot like the highly publicized controversy over NFL concussions. So why has there been so little public discussion about our troops? As it turns out, the military science could have important applications to civilian life.
The Philadelphia Eagles are Super Bowl champions.
Just before this year's Super Bowl 52, the National Football League released figures on how many concussions have been reported during the season. 291, a number on the rise. That got a lot of news coverage.
The NFL is studying how to deal with a 58% increase in concussions.
Look, it's like smoking cigarettes playing football is. You shouldn't need a Surgeon General's warning on the package to know it's bad for you.
Concern over sports concussions is prompting change at every level, down to Pee-wee leagues.
Recording every hit they took to the head over the course of a single season.
But the number of NFL concussions is dwarfed by the lesser publicized problem of traumatic brain injury from concussions in the military, estimated at well beyond 22,000 per year. To look at what's happening with the NFL attention on concussions and the military attention on concussions, what are your observations about that?
Well, I've been involved directly in both of them.
Dr. David Brody is a lead researcher of traumatic brain injury in the military.
Before I came here, I was at Washington University in St. Louis, and I was the director of one of the retired player care programs for National Football League players. So I saw quite a few retired NFL players in my clinic and took care of them as my patients. And there are a lot of similarities between the retired players and the military service members, but there's also some substantial differences. Sports concussions occur in basically a friendly environment. No one's shooting at you. The guy next to you didn't get blown up and lose both legs. The guy on the other side of you didn't get killed. So the combination of injury and the stress of war is completely different.
And worse.
And worse.
By definition, war is chaos. But the military is moving quickly to limit exposure on the field of fire they can control, training.
I'm sure I got it as much from training because the type of equipment that we use is it's going to give it to you.
Dave Hall is a former Navy SEAL who continued to serve even after he almost lost his leg in a 2004 explosion in Iraq. He also believes he suffers from traumatic brain injury.
My friends, my peers that have it, I think you almost have to fall off the edge and survive it. Otherwise, it's so insidious. It's like being gassed in your sleep. You don't really know that that's what it is that's encroaching on your life.
The head of the Naval Special Warfare Command is addressing the growing concerns by calling for a list of changes, including limiting and monitoring explosive training, identifying and treating traumatic brain injuries earlier, and what would be one of the most important initiatives, baseline screening. That means establishing the health of the soldier's brain on the front end to have something to compare it to later.
I just think monitoring it is one thing, getting a baseline of people that are coming in and seeing, okay, where was the place where they diverged.
Hall says addressing the issue head-on is necessary to keep the U.S. military strong.
Ultimately, I think the force is going to hit a point where the word gets out there to these young men. There's so many young men that are super fit that want to be SEALs because we're like legend in popular culture right now. But when that shifts to like, hey, you know, it's a really bad career path, you're probably going to come in, your brain's not going to be right, and if you start acting a little bit squirrely, the leadership is probably going to throw you out with a characterization that you probably can't even get a job washing cars in a parking lot.
The science and solutions are a work in progress, but something that could ultimately help civilians too.
Why does this matter to you? This matters to you because if your son or daughter has a concussion playing soccer or football, or if you have a car accident or a fall or an assault, we need to be able to detect it so that we can treat it appropriately in the future. Just as in all of history, war has led to advances in trauma care, we hope that this technology that we're learning about from visualizing the invisible wounds of war in Iraq and Afghanistan will translate to improved concussion care for every one of you and your families.
Dave Hall sees Ryan Larkin as a hero. He's the Navy SEAL who tried to flag the problem, ultimately took his own life, and donated his brain to traumatic brain injury research.
Looking at the whole thing now, you go, my God, this guy just had the moral courage to say, hey, I have a problem. And I think a lot of it was because he saw it happening to his peers as well and thought, well, if you're not going to say something, I will, and then maybe we'll all get helped.
Ryan served his country honorably, was a brave young man. It almost strikes me as if he was killed in action.
He was. He just didn't die right away.
There's been a quiet but dramatic shift in where we get our prescription drugs. We're increasingly dependent on China, and that could be a major national security risk. Healthcare author Rosemary Gibson makes a convincing case in her new book, China RX, exposing the risks of America's dependence on China for medicine. In the 1990s, the U.S., Europe, and Japan manufactured 90% of the key ingredients for medicine and vitamins, but now China is the largest global supplier. Why the change?
The change is because when we started buying generic drugs, which are terrific because they can be a lot less costly than brand name drugs, we had to find a cheaper way to make them. And China was more than willing, with its lower labor costs, to be a place where companies could buy those key ingredients.
We're talking about antibiotics, chemotherapies, antidepressants. What are the kinds of things?
Well, now the generic drugs that we're buying from China and Chinese companies in China include blood pressure medicines, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, epilepsy, antidepressants, the whole range of generic drugs now that we are importing from China.
Do doctors know about this and take this into account when they're prescribing medicine?
And doctors have no clue. Doctors and patients, no one really knows about this big shift in where our medicines are coming from.
What are some of the overview problems that the FDA finds when they do look at plants in China?
I'll give you one example. There's a very large company in China that was making 29 different products for the United States. The FDA went in and found systemic data manipulation. The FDA went in because there were lots of consumer complaints about the products. There were particles in them and other things. And so the FDA banned 29 of those drugs. But because we're so dependent on China and dependent on that company, the FDA had to exempt 14 of those products from its own ban, just so we wouldn't have a shortage. We're talking about antibiotics. That's how dependent we are as a country.
It sounds kind of outrageous that you're saying the FDA banned products for safety reasons and then lifted the ban on some of them because there would have been a shortage.
Exactly right. And we're talking about chemotherapy products, and we need chemotherapy. And how many people know this?
There is one case where we have been able to pinpoint a huge contamination problem from Chinese drugs.
Yes, in 2007 and 2008, a very commonly used drug in hospitals all over the country. It's called heparin. The active ingredient came from China, and it turns out it was contaminated.
A blood thinner?
Heparin is a blood thinner used in hospitals, in operating rooms, in kidney dialysis centers, and it turns out it was contaminated with a lethal contaminant. How many people were affected? We really don't know. There are official reports to the FDA about 250 people died associated with heparin, but do we really know the full course of it? How do we know?
Why should we be concerned from a national security standpoint?
What happens if we have a Fukushima type event? Or the trade routes are blocked in the South China Sea? Or if there's a global pandemic and the United States and virtually every other country in the world is dependent on a few companies in China for the ingredients to make critical antibiotics.
If China stopped making or sending its ingredients to the United States for any reason, would it cause shortages in the United States?
Within months, pharmacy shelves in the United States would be bare. That's how dependent the United States is and the rest of the world. It's a national security issue that no one's talking about.
Gibson says it's crucial for the U.S. to develop an industry to make our own medicines here like we used to, which she says would be good for business, quality control, and national security. We'll be right back. Next week on Full Measure, the new dangers of asbestos.
Millions of tons of asbestos created a successful and very profitable industry.
You might already know that it's sometimes found in older houses and can pose a serious health risk. But if you thought it had been banned in the U.S., we have news. It's still being used in many products today, including in our homes. And you're a firefighter. And you didn't have any idea about that?
Nobody seems to have any idea about it. The contractors that I'm talking to, they have no idea about it. I was calling senators' offices, congresswomen and men's offices. Nobody had any clue that asbestos is still here in Florida, that contractors are allowed to build with it here in Florida.
We investigate the little-known enduring presence of asbestos in our lives next week. Until then, we'll be searching for more stories that hold powers accountable and look for us on social media. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. Thanks for watching.